Alsace, France, January 17th, 1945. 14:47 hours. The snow beneath Captain Fritz Weber's body turned crimson in irregular, pulsing circles. Each heartbeat sent another wave of warmth spreading outward, steaming slightly in the frozen air of the Alsatian plain. His fingers, already numb, clutched at the tourniquet his corporal had twisted around his thigh, too loose, applied in panic, useless against the severed femoral artery that was draining his life into the white earth. Above him, the sky churned with black smoke from burning vehicles. The metallic thunder of American artillery rolled across the battlefield like the breathing of some massive invisible beast. Weber tried to speak, to give orders, but his tongue felt thick, foreign. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. At its end he could see his men retreating, their field-gray uniforms disappearing into the tree line. They were leaving him. They had to. The order had come from headquarters. Retreat, regroup, survive. There was no provision for the dying. He would be 28 years old for another 6 days. Or perhaps just 6 minutes. The last thing Captain Fritz Weber remembered before the darkness folded over him completely was the absurd clarity of a single thought. So this is how it ends. Not with meaning, just with cold. By the winter of 1945, the arithmetic of war had become brutally simple. The German Wehrmacht, which had conquered a continent 5 years earlier, now bled from 1,000 wounds across a shrinking perimeter. In the Alsace region wedged between the Rhine and the Vosges Mountains, the American 7th Army ground forward through snow and resistance, village by village, bunker by bunker. The official casualty report spoke in antiseptic numbers. 3,000 German soldiers killed or wounded each week, 1,500 American. Behind these figures lay the actual mathematics of trauma, the calculations that field medics performed in split seconds, triaging the salvageable from the lost. Lieutenant Robert Miller had learned these calculations at the Army Medical School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where instructors had drilled a simple hierarchy into their students. Treat your own first, stabilize allies second, ignore enemies unless ordered otherwise. Resources were finite: blood, plasma, morphine, sulfa drugs, all rationed, all tracked, all reserved for American boys who deserved to go home. The official field manual FM 8-55 was explicit. Medical supplies will not be expended on enemy combatants except when excess capacity permits and strategic intelligence value justifies such expenditure. Miller, 32 years old, former instructor in emergency medicine, veteran of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, had followed these protocols for 22 months. He had performed over 400 field surgeries, had held the hands of dying 19-year-olds from Iowa and Texas and New York, had learned to compartmentalize grief into the few minutes between patients. He had become efficient. He had become hard. He had become exactly what the Army needed him to be. The medic station where he worked, a reinforced stone barn 2 kilometers behind the forward positions, processed an average of 40 casualties per day. Plasma bottles hung from wooden beams like transparent fruit. The floor, despite constant mopping, remained perpetually sticky with blood. The smell was a permanent installation: copper and iodine and gangrene, and the peculiar sweet rot odor of torn intestines. Miller had long ago stopped noticing it. What he had not stopped noticing was the sound of men screaming, the sound of men praying in languages he didn't understand, the sound of men dying quietly, their breath becoming shallow, then irregular, then absent. These sounds followed him into his few hours of sleep, performed themselves in the theater of his exhausted mind. On the afternoon of January 17th, Miller was on his 19th consecutive hour of duty. His hands shook slightly from fatigue and too much coffee. He had just finished debriding shrapnel wounds on a private from Pennsylvania, a kid who kept asking if he'd be home for his sister's wedding in March, when the corpsman carried in the German. They brought Weber in on a stretcher fashioned from a barn door, his field-gray uniform soaked black with blood. His face had the waxen pallor of severe hemorrhage, lips blue-tinged, breathing shallow and rapid. The tourniquet on his thigh was a disaster. applied over the uniform, twisted with a rifle cleaning rod that had already loosened, effectively useless. Blood seeped steadily from beneath the makeshift bandage. Miller looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. His trained eye performed the assessment automatically. Femoral artery breach, class 4 hemorrhage, blood pressure likely below 70/40, shock imminent if not already established. Without intervention, maybe 10 minutes left. With intervention, if they had the blood, the time, the supplies, maybe 50-50 odds. "Leave him in the corner," Miller said, turning back to his American patient. "I'll look at him when we have capacity." It was the correct decision. It was the decision his training demanded. It was the decision that would let him sleep at night, knowing he'd prioritized correctly, knowing he'd followed orders, knowing he'd done right by the boys who wore the same uniform he did. The corpsman laid Weber against the far wall, next to 3 other German wounded who'd been captured that morning. One had a sucking chest wound that would likely kill him before dawn. Another had lost his left foot and was mercifully unconscious. The third sat with his back against the stone, holding his shattered arm, watching everything with the alert wariness of a trapped animal. Miller sutured the Pennsylvania kid's wounds, applied fresh bandages, administered morphine, filled out the evacuation tag. The whole process took 12 minutes. Efficient, professional, by the book. But something had changed in the silence between needle insertions. Miller became aware that he was listening to the German officer's breathing. It had developed a pattern, 3 shallow gasps, a pause where nothing happened, then a shuddering intake that sounded like drowning. The pause was getting longer. The body, starved of oxygen, was beginning the process of shutting down non-essential systems. Soon, it would shut down essential ones, too. Miller had heard this pattern hundreds of times. He knew what it meant. He knew how much time was left. He stood motionless, holding the Pennsylvania kid's completed evacuation form, staring at nothing in particular. Around him, the barn continued its usual chaos. Corpsmen moving between patients, the hiss of sterilizers, someone crying for water, the distant thump of artillery that had become as constant as heartbeat. 7 minutes had passed since they'd brought the German in. "Lieutenant?" One of his corpsmen, a kid from Nebraska named Kowalski, stood waiting for instructions. Miller made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. He was performing a different kind of calculation now. Not the official one, not the one from FM 8-55. A different arithmetic entirely. If he followed orders, the German would be dead in 3 minutes, maybe 5. One less enemy. One less Wehrmacht officer who might, in some alternative future, kill American soldiers. The strategic logic was unassailable. But Miller was thinking about the Hippocratic oath he'd taken 8 years ago in a medical school auditorium in Philadelphia. First, do no harm. He was thinking about the man he'd been before the war, the doctor who'd treated pneumonia in Polish immigrants and set broken bones for Irish dock workers and delivered babies in tenement apartments at 3 in the morning. He was thinking about a thing he'd read once, something attributed to the medieval Jewish physician Maimonides. "May I never see in the patient anything but a fellow creature in pain." The German's breathing stopped entirely. 5 seconds. 6. 7. Then restarted with a horrible rattling gasp. Miller moved before he'd consciously decided to move. 3 strides across the barn floor. He dropped to his knees beside the stretcher, his hands already reaching for the tourniquet. "Kowalski, type him, now." "Sir, we can't—" "The orders say—" "I know what the orders say. Type him." Miller's fingers worked the soaked fabric of Weber's uniform, cutting it away with surgical shears. The wound was worse than he'd estimated. The shrapnel had torn a 3-inch gash in the upper thigh, severing the femoral artery completely. The muscle tissue around it was macerated, complicating repair. This would require direct pressure, proper surgical ligation, and immediate volume replacement. In other words, impossible under field conditions, especially for an enemy combatant, especially when they had 6 American critical cases waiting for evacuation. "Sir." Kowalski's voice was tight. "He's type A positive." Miller felt something cold move through his chest. He didn't need to check his own dog tags. He already knew. Type A positive. The same. In January of 1945, blood transfusion technology was still primitive by later standards. Plasma could be stored and transported, but whole blood, needed for severe hemorrhage, had to be fresh, had to be matched, had to be transferred directly from donor to recipient through rubber tubing and a prayer. Blood banks existed in rear echelon hospitals, but here, 3 kilometers from active combat, the only blood available was the blood in living bodies. Miller looked down at his own left arm, at the veins visible beneath the skin. He'd donated blood twice before, both times for American soldiers. He knew the procedure. He knew the risks: weakness, dizziness, reduced combat effectiveness if he needed to move quickly. He knew what would happen if a senior medical officer discovered what he was about to do. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was going to do it anyway. "Set up for direct transfusion," he said quietly. "Get me 2 16-gauge needles, rubber tubing, and sodium citrate. Move." The next 28 minutes existed outside of time, outside of military hierarchy, outside of national allegiance. In the dim interior of the stone barn, lit by 2 kerosene lamps and the gray afternoon light filtering through shrapnel holes in the roof, Miller performed an act that defied every regulation he'd sworn to uphold. First, he stabilized the bleeding with proper surgical technique, clamping the artery, ligating it with catgut suture, packing the wound with sulfanilamide powder to prevent infection. His hands, which had been shaking from exhaustion 20 minutes earlier, were now perfectly steady. Adrenaline and purpose had burned away the fatigue. Weber remained unconscious throughout, his body limp, his face the color of old paper. His pulse, when Miller could find it, was thready and irregular, the heart struggling to pump blood that was no longer there. Then came the transfusion. Kowalski inserted 1 16-gauge needle into Miller's left antecubital vein, another into Weber's right arm. The rubber tubing connected them, with a small reservoir containing sodium citrate to prevent clotting. There were no pumps, no mechanical assistance. Gravity and pressure differential did the work, pulling blood from Miller's body into Weber's, 1 slow drop at a time. Miller lay on the floor beside the German officer's stretcher, his arm extended, watching the dark red blood flow through the transparent tubing. He could feel the pull of it, the strange sensation of his own life force leaving his body, traveling through rubber and chemistry into the body of an enemy. It should have felt wrong. It should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like the first clean thing he'd done in 2 years of war. Around them, the barn's usual chaos continued, but somehow muted, as if they occupied a separate space. Kowalski stood guard, blocking the view of other corpsmen, buying time. The Pennsylvania kid, sedated with morphine, slept on his cot. The other German wounded watched in silence, understanding something profound was happening, but not daring to speak. Minutes accumulated. 5, 10, 15. Miller began to feel the effects, the hollowness in his chest, the subtle tremor in his fingers, the gravitational pull that seemed to be drawing his consciousness downward. He'd given too much. He knew he'd given too much. But Weber's pulse was strengthening, his breathing evening out, his skin regaining the faintest hint of color. "Sir, that's enough. You need to stop." Kowalski's voice came from far away. "Another minute. Lieutenant, you're showing symptoms. I'm stopping this." Miller wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't assemble themselves properly. He watched, detached, as Kowalski disconnected the tubing, applied pressure to both insertion sites, wrapped them in gauze. The world tilted slightly, then stabilized. Miller tried to sit up, managed it on the second attempt. Weber's eyes were open, just barely, just slits, but open, looking at him, aware. Miller met that gaze for perhaps 3 seconds. He couldn't read what he saw there. Confusion, certainly. Shock, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. The acknowledgement that passes between one human being and another when all the ideologies and uniforms and national identities fall away, leaving only the simple fact of existence. Neither man spoke. Weber didn't speak German. Miller didn't speak English. But the communication happened anyway, in that ancient language that predates words. Then Weber's eyes closed again, and he slipped back into unconscious recovery. Miller sat against the barn wall for 20 minutes, drinking water, eating crackers from a ration pack, waiting for his blood pressure to stabilize. His head throbbed. His vision occasionally sparked with dark spots. But he was functional. He would survive his own generosity. The Pennsylvania Kid was evacuated at 1600 hours. 3 more American wounded arrived at 1620. Miller treated them all, following protocols, doing his job. Nobody mentioned the German officer lying in the corner, breathing steadily now, his color improved, his vital signs approaching normal ranges. At 1900 hours, a captain from Headquarters Medical Command arrived to inspect the facility. He walked through the barn, reviewing patient logs, checking supply inventory, making notes on a clipboard. When he reached the German wounded, he stopped. This one. He pointed at Weber. "He's stable?" "Yes, sir," Miller said. His voice came out level, professional. "Blood loss?" "Severe. Class 4 hemorrhage. I stabilized him with standard field procedures." The captain looked at Miller for a long moment, then down at the bandage on Miller's left arm, visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, then back at Miller's face. "Standard procedures," the captain repeated. "Yes, sir." Another long pause. The barn had gone quiet. Everyone was listening, though pretending not to. The captain made a notation on his clipboard. "Send him to the rear hospital in Strasbourg. They'll want him for intelligence debriefing when he's recovered." "Yes, sir." The captain turned to leave, then paused. Without looking back, he said, "There's a reason the Hippocratic Oath predates military regulations, Lieutenant, though I'd appreciate if you didn't make me explain that to battalion command." "Understood, sir." After the captain left, the barn exhaled. Kowalski caught Miller's eye and smiled slightly. No words were necessary. Weber was evacuated the following morning. Miller never saw him again during the war. He had no idea if the German officer survived his wounds, if he recovered fully, if he made it home. That was how war worked. People intersected for moments of terrible intimacy, then disappeared into the vast machinery of history, their fates unknown. Miller continued his work in the Alsace, then through the Rhineland, then into Germany itself as the war ground toward its conclusion. He performed 400 more field surgeries, saved lives, lost lives, became more efficient, more hardened, more necessary. But something had changed on that January afternoon in the stone barn. Some small resistance had formed inside him, a refusal to let the arithmetic of war complete its equation. He'd broken orders. He'd risked disciplinary action. He'd weakened himself in a combat zone. And he would do it again, given the same circumstances, the same impossible choice between obedience and humanity. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, other medics from the 7th Army would describe Miller as the one who showed what medical service meant, even in hell. Some admired him. Some thought he'd been dangerously sentimental. None forgot him. Spring came to Europe in gradual, hesitant stages. By early May of 1945, the Third Reich had collapsed into rubble and surrender. Millions of German prisoners of war filled hastily constructed camps across the occupied territories, waiting for repatriation, waiting for trials, waiting to learn if they had homes to return to. Captain Fritz Weber, recovered from his wounds and walking with a permanent limp, found himself in one of these camps near Mannheim. The accommodations were basic but adequate: canvas tents, sufficient food, basic medical care, better than many German civilians were experiencing in the destroyed cities, better than Weber had any right to expect. He should have been bitter. He should have been broken. Instead, he felt a strange sense of obligation that he couldn't quite articulate, even to himself. The American medic had given him something more than blood and surgery. He'd given him a different way of understanding what had happened, what might happen next. When the American military administration issued a call for German prisoners with English language skills to serve as translators and liaisons, Weber volunteered immediately. His English, learned at university before the war, was fluent. His engineering background made him useful for reconstruction planning. But what made him invaluable was something else. his willingness to serve as a bridge between victor and vanquished, his understanding that the future could not be built on continued enmity. Over the following months, Weber worked 12-hour days, translating documents, facilitating negotiations between American officers and German civilian administrators, helping coordinate the massive effort to rebuild infrastructure, restart factories, establish new municipal governments. The work was exhausting, often frustrating, always complicated by suspicion on both sides. But Weber discovered something unexpected: respect. Not universal, not immediate, but earned gradually through competence and consistency. The American officers he worked with began to trust his judgment, to value his insights, to see him as something other than simply the enemy. One evening in August, during a planning session for railroad reconstruction, an American colonel asked Weber why he'd volunteered for this work. Why not just wait for repatriation, go home, try to rebuild his own life? Weber considered the question carefully. Then he told the story he'd been telling in various forms for months. The story of the Alsatian plain, the femoral artery, the American medic who'd violated orders to perform a transfusion that saved a German officer's life. "I don't know his name," Weber said. "I was barely conscious. But I understood what he did, what it meant, what it cost him. That kind of action creates obligation. Not the obligation of debt, but the obligation of example. He showed me that we can choose to be human, even when everything tells us to be otherwise. So I choose this. I choose to help build something better than what we destroyed." The colonel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The medic's name was Miller. Robert Miller. He's back in the States now, teaching medicine in Philadelphia." Weber felt something shift in his chest. A name, a location, a confirmation that the man had been real, had survived the war, had returned to the work of healing. He wrote the information down carefully, though he wasn't sure what he would do with it. Send a letter? Try to express in written English what couldn't really be expressed in any language. In the end, he did write. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. A letter that went through multiple drafts, each one trying to articulate gratitude without sentimentality, understanding without presumption. He mailed it in November of 1945, not knowing if it would arrive, if Miller would remember, if the gesture would mean anything. 3 months later, he received a reply. Brief, professional, but warm beneath the formality. "I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you're helping rebuild. That's all any of us can do: survive, help, build. The rest is just noise." Weber kept that letter for the rest of his life. 42 more years of life, as it turned out. 42 years of translation work, then teaching, then consulting. 42 years of marriage to a woman he met during Reconstruction. 3 children, 7 grandchildren. 42 years of limping on his left leg, feeling the old wound ache in cold weather, remembering the snow-covered plain where he should have died. He told the story often. Not obsessively, not as some kind of defining trauma, but as a teaching moment, a reminder, a counterweight to all the other stories from that war. He told it to his children when they asked why he didn't hate Americans. He told it to his students when they asked about moral complexity. He told it to journalists and historians who interviewed him in his later years, trying to capture the texture of memory before the last witnesses died. The core of the story never changed, but its meaning evolved. In the immediate aftermath of the war, it was a story about unexpected mercy. In the 1950s and 60s, it became a story about transcending propaganda. In the 70s and 80s, it transformed into a parable about individual conscience versus institutional pressure. But always, underneath every version, it remained simply the story of 2 men, one German, one American, who met for 28 minutes in a stone barn on a winter afternoon, and through that meeting demonstrated that humanity could survive even in the mathematics of war. Lieutenant Robert Miller, for his part, spoke less about the incident, not from trauma or regret, but from a different understanding of what had happened. For him, the transfusion was not an exceptional act, but simply the correct one. the fulfillment of his medical oath, the alignment of training and conscience. He'd done what doctors do. That was all. He returned to Philadelphia in July of 1945, resumed his practice, eventually joined the faculty at Temple University's medical school. He taught emergency medicine and trauma surgery, trained a new generation of doctors, published papers on field triage protocols and combat casualty care, a successful career by any measure. When Weber's letter arrived, Miller replied because it seemed the polite thing to do. When journalists asked about the incident, he confirmed the basic facts, but deflected attempts to make him into some kind of hero. I had the right blood type, he would say. That's all. Any medic would have done the same. But the younger medics who'd served with him in Alsace knew this wasn't true. They remembered the other German wounded who'd been left to die, the times when resources were genuinely scarce, and choices had to be made. They remembered that Miller had made a choice that most medics wouldn't have made at a time when hatred of the enemy was not just acceptable, but expected. In 1962, Miller received an unexpected visitor at his Philadelphia practice, a limping German man in his early 40s, well-dressed, speaking excellent English, asking if the doctor had a few minutes to talk. Miller looked at him for a moment, seeing something familiar in the face, but not quite placing it. Then the German said his name, and 17 years collapsed into instant recognition. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the war, not really. About medicine, about their families, about the strange paths that lives take. Weber showed Miller photographs of his children. Miller showed Weber the letter he'd kept, yellowed now but still legible. When they said goodbye, they shook hands in the American style, but also embraced briefly in the European manner. Two men, no longer enemies, barely friends, but connected by something deeper than either category could encompass. They corresponded occasionally after that, Christmas cards, brief updates. Miller attended Weber's funeral in 1987, flying to Germany for the service, listening to eulogies in a language he still didn't speak, but somehow understood. He was 94 years old by then, white-haired, frail, but still sharp-eyed and steady-handed. At the reception after the funeral, Weber's eldest daughter approached Miller and asked if he would tell the story one more time for the grandchildren who had only heard it second-hand. Miller hesitated. Then he agreed. He told it simply, without embellishment, just the facts. The wound, the transfusion, the recovery. 28 minutes in a barn. A choice between orders and conscience. Blood flowing through rubber tubing. One body to another. Life transferring between enemies. When he finished, the youngest grandchild, maybe 7 years old, asked, "Were you scared?" Miller considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said, "not of dying, but of becoming the kind of person who could watch someone die when I had the power to prevent it. That scared me more than anything the war had shown me. The mathematics of war are brutal and simple. So many tons of steel delivered onto so many square kilometers of earth, producing so many casualties per hour, requiring so many medics and so many units of blood and so many evacuation vehicles. The equations balance themselves through death and logistics, supply and demand, acceptable losses and strategic necessity. But sometimes, rarely, unpredictably, impossibly, the mathematics break down. A medic makes a choice that defies calculation. A captain looks the other way. A wounded enemy becomes a translator, then a bridge builder, then a teacher who passes the story forward to children and grandchildren, who pass it forward in turn. The blood that Lieutenant Robert Miller transfused into Captain Fritz Weber on January 17, 1945, continued to circulate, not just through Weber's body, but through the decades that followed, through the families that grew, through the students who learned, through the story that repeated itself in different languages and contexts, but always with the same essential meaning. We are not only what the war makes us. We are also what we choose to be in the moments when choosing seems impossible. Miller died in 1991 at the age of 98, having outlived most of his generation. Weber had preceded him by 4 years. Both men left behind families, careers, modest legacies in their respective fields. But they also left behind something else, A single afternoon in a stone barn, preserved in memory and testimony, a small proof that humanity can survive its own worst intentions. The barn itself no longer exists. It was demolished in the 1960s to make way for a highway. The Alsatian plain where Weber was wounded is now farmland, producing wheat and rapeseed. The snow-covered battlefield long since returned to peaceful agriculture. The only physical remnant is a small plaque in the Strasbourg Military Hospital commemorating the medical personnel who served there during the war. Miller's name appears on it, along with hundreds of others. No special notation, no explanation of what he did or why it mattered. But the story lives. In family memories, in medical ethics courses, in the occasional documentary about combat medicine. Not famous, not widely known, but persistent, surviving. Like the blood type they shared, a positive, it flows through the generations, carried forward by those who understand that the most important choices are often the ones that defy the official calculus, the authorized equations, the strategic logic that reduces human beings to inputs and outputs. 28 minutes, one transfusion, two lives that intersected at the exact moment when death seemed inevitable and mercy seemed impossible. And then, against all odds, mercy anyway. That's not how the mathematics of war are supposed to work. But sometimes, just sometimes, the mathematics are wrong.